In the year 872, on the freezing waters of Hafrsfjord, Vikings did not fight Christians. They slaughtered each other. One man, Harald Fairhair, killed enough Vikings to end Viking freedom forever. This is how Norway was born. They tell you the Viking world was destroyed by outsiders, by Christian kings, by foreign armies. That is a lie. The Viking age did not end when Vikings were defeated. It ended when Vikings chose to be ruled. This is not a story about heroes. It is not a story about unity. It is a story about something far more dangerous: power. Because power does not arrive as an enemy. It arrives as a solution. Before Norway existed, there was no country at all. Only a broken coastline, deep fjords cutting into stone, mountains isolating men from men. Every valley had its own ruler. Every harbor had its own king. They were Vikings, raiders, warriors, free men. There was no crown above them, no law they did not consent to. If a ruler became too strong, he was killed. If a king demanded obedience, he was challenged. This was not chaos. It was a system designed to make control impossible. And for centuries it worked. Vikings accepted many things: violence, death, blood feuds that lasted generations. But there was one thing they would never accept: submission. A Viking could kneel before the gods. He would never kneel before another Viking. Freedom was not an idea, it was instinct. And instinct kept Norway divided and free. Then came Harald Fairhair. He was not the strongest Viking. He was not the most feared. He was something far more dangerous. He was patient. Harald did not want plunder. He did not want tribute. He wanted permanence. One law, one authority, one king. Legend says he swore an oath. He would not cut his hair until all of Norway belonged to him. This was not vanity, it was a threat, a living promise that he would not stop. To the other Viking kings, Harald represented something worse than death. He represented the end of choice. No more deciding when to fight. No more choosing when to raid. No more ruling yourself. To accept Harald meant becoming a subject, and subjects are not Vikings. So they did the only thing they could do. They prepared for war. This war would not be decided on land. It would be decided at sea, in a narrow fjord on Norway's western coast, where escape was impossible and retreat meant drowning. Its name was Hafrsfjord. Longships filled the water, prows carved like monsters, oars striking the sea like war drums. This was not a raid. There would be no leaving. The battle was not strategy. It was collision. Ships slammed together, hooks tore into shields, men boarded enemy decks and stopped, because they recognized the faces in front of them. Men they had raided with, feasted with, fought beside. There were no foreigners here. Only Vikings killing Vikings. Axes rose and fell. Swords punched through mail. Men were shoved into the water, dragged down by their own armor. The fjord turned red. This was not conquest. This was erasure. When the fighting ended, Harald stood victorious, not because he was merciful, but because mercy has no place in the birth of a crown. The defeated kings were given three choices: die, submit, or flee Norway forever. Many chose exile, and in fleeing they carried the Viking world outward, to Iceland, to distant islands, to the edges of the known world. Freedom did not disappear, it escaped. Harald cut his hair. History remembers him as the first king of Norway. But remember this: Norway was not born from unity. It was born when Vikings killed Vikings, because every kingdom in history is built the same way, by destroying the world that came before it. Before Norway ever had a king, it had something far more dangerous: freedom. Not the kind written in laws, not the kind protected by borders, but the kind enforced by violence, the kind that kills anyone who tries to rule it. Before there was Norway, there was no country at all, no capital, no borders, no single name for the land, only a coastline shattered by the sea, fjords cutting deep into stone like open wounds, mountains rising between men, making neighbors strangers. This land did not unite people. It isolated them, and isolation gave birth to power. Every valley had its own ruler, every harbor its own king. Not kings crowned by ceremony, but kings crowned by fear. They ruled because they could fight, because they could kill, because no one had yet proven stronger. These men were Vikings, raiders, warriors, seafarers who trusted wood, wind, and steel more than any promise made by another man. There was no central authority, no throne above them, no law that could not be challenged by a blade. If a king grew too strong, he was killed. If a ruler demanded obedience, he was challenged, not debated, not negotiated, challenged. Because power in the Viking world was temporary by design. A man could rule today and be a corpse tomorrow, and everyone knew it. This was not chaos. It only looks like chaos to those who believe order must come from above. In truth, this was a system, a brutal one, a violent one, but precise. It was designed to prevent control. No king ruled long enough to build a crown that could not be broken. No dynasty lasted long enough to forget that power could be taken away. Fear kept everyone equal. The Vikings accepted many things. They accepted violence as a language. They accepted death as a companion. They accepted blood feuds that lasted generations. Sons killing the sons of men long buried. All of this was normal. All of this was expected. But there was one thing they would never accept: submission. A Viking could kneel before the gods, before thunder, before fate, but he would never kneel before another Viking. To kneel meant surrender. To surrender meant weakness, and weakness meant death. This belief was not written, it was understood, taught by example, enforced by steel. This single rule shaped everything. It shaped how Vikings fought, how they ruled, how they lived. A king could lead. He could inspire. He could command, for a time. But the moment he crossed the line from leader to master, the moment he demanded obedience instead of loyalty, the moment he expected submission, he signed his own death sentence. And because of this rule, the land remained divided. Not weak, divided. There is a difference. Division meant no one could dominate. No one could centralize power. No one could turn free warriors into subjects. For centuries, this belief kept the land unconquered, not by outsiders, by itself. The Vikings did not lack unity because they were incapable of it. They rejected unity because they understood its cost. Unity requires hierarchy. Hierarchy requires obedience. And obedience was the one thing they would not give. This was the world before Norway, a world without a king, without a crown, without a center. A world where freedom survived not because it was gentle, but because it was ruthless. And it worked. Until one man decided that this system, this sacred refusal to kneel, was the problem. Because the moment a people decide that freedom is inconvenient, a king is already on his way. He did not arrive with the largest army. He did not arrive with the sharpest blade. He arrived with time, and time is the most lethal weapon of all. His name was Harald Fairhair. The Vikings were used to strong men. They respected strength. They feared violence. They understood brutality. Harald was none of that, at least not at first. He was not the strongest Viking. He was not the most feared. He was something far more dangerous. He was patient. While others raided for silver, Harald watched. While other kings fought each other for land, Harald waited. Because Harald did not want to win battles. He wanted to end the game. Legend says Harald swore an oath. He would not cut his hair. He would not trim it. He would not tame it. Not until all of Norway belonged to him. This was not vanity. This was psychology. Every time another king saw him, they saw the same uncut hair. A visible reminder. A warning. I am still coming. In a world where power was temporary, Harald made his ambition permanent. Viking kings were used to rivals who fought, lost, and disappeared. Harald did not disappear. He returned. Again and again. He did not rush. He advanced slowly, taking territory, removing rivals, absorbing strength. He understood something the other Viking kings did not. Freedom can survive violence. It cannot survive structure. Harald did not want tribute. Tribute was temporary. It could be refused. It could be stopped. Harald wanted something far worse. Permanence, taxes, law, order, everything Vikings hated. Everything Vikings had killed kings for. To the Viking mind, taxes meant submission. Law meant obedience. Order meant someone else deciding your life. To accept Harald meant the end of choice. No more choosing when to fight. No more choosing when to raid. No more choosing who ruled you. You would no longer be free. You would be governed. This is why Harald terrified them. Not because he killed more men, but because he threatened to change what it meant to be a Viking. He did not want warriors. He wanted subjects. And subjects do not raid when they choose. They raid when they are told. Every Viking king understood the danger, because they had built their power on the promise that no one ruled above them. Harald was not challenging their strength. He was challenging their legitimacy. If Harald succeeded, their entire world would collapse. Their authority, their independence, their freedom, all gone. So the other kings did something they almost never did. They united, not to rule, but to stop someone from ruling them. Old rivals set aside feuds. Men who hated each other shared ships, not because they trusted one another, but because they feared Harald more. This alliance was not built on loyalty. It was built on panic. They understood that this was their last chance. If Harald won, there would be no more challenges, no more balance, no more freedom enforced by fear. There would be a king, and kings, once accepted, are impossible to remove. The Vikings had always believed that power must remain fragile. Harald believed the opposite, that power must be permanent, that order was worth the blood. This was the moment everything changed. Because for the first time in Viking history, the greatest threat to Viking freedom was not a foreign enemy. It was one of their own. A Viking who had decided that freedom was inefficient, that chaos was wasteful, that it was time for someone to rule. The Vikings did not yet know where this road would end. They only knew one thing. If Harald was not stopped, the Viking world they understood would cease to exist. And so they sailed. Toward a narrow fjord. Toward a battle they could not avoid. Toward a moment where Vikings would decide whether freedom was worth dying for. Because once a man like Harald appears, history never turns back. This war would not be decided on land. There would be no retreat into forests, no mountains to hide behind, no borders to fall back across. This war would be decided at sea, in a place where escape did not exist. The Vikings had fought countless battles on land. Their defeat could mean survival. A man could run, a king could regroup, a war could continue. At sea there was no such mercy. A ship was not a position, it was a commitment. Once you sailed into battle, you were already trapped. The fleets moved west, toward Norway's broken coastline, toward a narrow fjord where stone walls rose on both sides and the sea itself became a prison. Its name would be remembered as the Battle of Hafrsfjord. This place was chosen deliberately. Here numbers mattered less than nerve. Here maneuver was impossible. Here retreat meant drowning. If you lost, you did not flee, you vanished. Longships filled the fjord, not dozens, hundreds. Their prows carved into beasts and gods, their hulls low in the water, heavy with men, weapons, and hatred. Oars struck the sea in unison, not to intimidate, to prepare. Because everyone there understood the truth. Only one side would leave. This was not a raid. There would be no quick strike, no stolen silver, no prisoners dragged away in chains. This was a decision, a final one. Either Harald's vision would die here, or Viking freedom would. The first collision came without warning. Not commands, not formations. Impact. Wood slammed into wood. Shields cracked against hulls. Iron hooks flew through the air, biting into railings and flesh alike. Ships locked together, and suddenly the battle stopped being naval and became personal. Men boarded enemy decks and froze, because the faces in front of them were not strangers. They were men they recognized, men they had sailed with, fought beside, drank with, former allies, former brothers in arms. There were no foreigners here, no invaders, only Vikings killing Vikings. Axes rose and fell, swords punched through mail, spears found gaps in armor designed for raids, not slaughter. Men screamed names, not battle cries, names. Some were shoved into the water, weighted down by armor that had once meant protection. They did not sink immediately. They thrashed, hands clawed at the sides of ships, fingertips scraping wood, until strength failed, and the sea closed over them. The fjord turned red, not metaphorically, literally. Blood mixed with salt water, spreading between ships that could no longer tell who they were fighting for. Only that stopping meant death. This was not strategy. There were no clever maneuvers left, no formations, no commands that mattered. This was endurance. This was will. This was who could keep swinging after fear had replaced reason. Men fought until weapons broke. Then they fought with shields, then with fists, then with teeth, because to fall meant the water, and the water meant disappearance. No body, no burial, no saga. This was not conquest. Conquest leaves survivors. This was erasure, an attempt to wipe out rivals so completely that no challenge could ever rise again. This was not about land. It was about the future. As the fighting dragged on, the truth became impossible to ignore. There would be no compromise, no truce, no shared Norway. One vision would drown here. And as the ships broke apart, as bodies piled on decks slick with blood, every Viking present understood something their ancestors had never faced before. This battle was not deciding a ruler. It was deciding whether Vikings would continue to rule themselves at all. When the fighting finally slowed, it was not because mercy had arrived. It was because resistance had ended. And the fjord, once crowded with ships, fell quiet, littered with wreckage, floating shields, and men who would never return home. Hafrsfjord had done its job. It had made retreat impossible, and defeat absolute, because from this place only one future could sail away. And when the oars finally lifted from the water, The Viking world would never be the same again. When the fighting ended, the sea did not celebrate. It fell silent, because victory had arrived, and it came without mercy. The oars stopped moving, the shouts faded, and standing above the wreckage of ships and men was one figure who had not backed down: Harald Fairhair. He did not win because he spared his enemies. He won because he broke them, completely. This was not a victory earned through negotiation. There were no treaties signed on blood-soaked decks, no compromise spoken between rival kings. Harald had not come to share Norway, he had come to end resistance, and now resistance was gone. The surviving kings were brought before him, men who had once ruled valleys, men who had commanded fleets, men who had never knelt in their lives. They were given 3 choices, not options: sentences, die, submit, or flee Norway forever. To die meant defiance, to submit meant obedience, to flee meant exile, abandoning land, power, ancestry, and honor. Many chose exile, not because it was easy, but because for a Viking, submission was worse than death. These men did not leave as peasants. They left as warriors, with ships, with families, with memories of a world that no longer existed. They sailed away carrying something invisible, the old Viking way of life. Harald watched them go, and in that moment, he accomplished something no Viking had ever done before. He centralized power, not temporarily, permanently. Norway was no longer a land of kings. It had one king and one law. But history rarely moves in straight lines, and this victory carried an irony so sharp it would shape the Viking Age itself. Because the men who fled Hafrsfjord did not abandon the Viking world. They exported it. They sailed west, beyond the reach of Harald's laws, beyond his taxes, beyond his crown, to empty lands, harsh lands, unforgiving lands, places where freedom could survive again. They settled in Iceland, on volcanic rock and frozen soil, a land with no king, no throne, no central authority, only assemblies, only law agreed upon, not enforced. It was the Viking world, reborn. Others sailed farther, to the Faroe Islands, to islands battered by wind and sea, places no king would bother ruling, places where distance itself was protection. There, Viking freedom survived, because it had nowhere else to go. This is the great irony of Hafrsfjord. Harald won, Norway unified, order replaced chaos. But the Viking Age did not shrink, it expanded, because freedom had been defeated at home. So it escaped abroad. The raids did not end, they multiplied. The Vikings did not disappear, they spread, across the North Atlantic, across coastlines that had never seen longships before. Harald's victory did not end the Viking world, it scattered it. And while Norway became a kingdom, stronger, centralized, controlled, the Viking spirit found new frontiers, new targets, new myths, all born from exile. History remembers Harald as a unifier, a nation builder, the first king of Norway. But history rarely remembers the cost, the thousands who died so one man could rule, the freedom that had to be destroyed to make a crown possible. Because kings do not rise where freedom thrives. They rise where freedom becomes inconvenient, where chaos feels expensive, where order feels necessary. Hafrsfjord was not just a battle, it was a decision, a choice made in blood, between a world of many kings and a world with only one. Harald chose order, the exiles chose freedom, and the Viking Age became both, a kingdom at home, a storm abroad. This is how Harald won, and this is how Viking freedom survived, by running from the very nation it had helped create. The battle was over, the blood had dried, and something far more dangerous than war had just begun: a king. After Hafrsfjord, the land we now call Norway had something it had never possessed before. Not victory, not peace, authority. For the first time, there was one man above all others, one voice that could not be challenged, one decision that could not be ignored. A crown had been born. With that crown came changes no Viking song would ever celebrate. Law, not the kind argued at assemblies, not the kind accepted by consensus. Law enforced by power, taxation, not gifts, not tribute freely given, a permanent claim on the labor of free men. Obedience, not loyalty earned through reputation, but submission demanded by position. The raids did not stop. Longships still crossed the sea, steel still met flesh, but something fundamental had changed. The raids were no longer choices, they were orders. Vikings did not fight when they felt like it. They fought when they were told. This is what a crown costs. Not silver, not gold, freedom. Because freedom does not survive organization. The moment a system becomes efficient, it becomes restrictive. The moment power becomes permanent, it becomes oppressive. Order always demands blood, first the blood of enemies, then the blood of those who resist. Harald understood this. He accepted it. Because to him, freedom was chaos. Chaos was weakness, and weakness invited destruction. Harald believed a kingdom was worth the price. History would later call Harald Fairhair a unifier, a nation builder, a visionary. But history rarely lingers on what had to die for that vision to live. The petty kings who ruled valleys, the independence of each harbor, the right to challenge power with steel, all gone. Norway became stronger, more stable, more predictable, and infinitely less free. That is the trade every civilization makes: security in exchange for obedience, order in exchange for choice. The Vikings learned a lesson history repeats endlessly. Empires do not fall when armies lose battles. They fall when people accept being ruled, because once obedience becomes normal, it becomes permanent. Harald cut his hair. The oath was complete. The wild, unbound symbol of his ambition was trimmed into order. A fitting end, because what he had built was no longer wild, it was controlled. History remembers this moment as the birth of a nation. But remember this instead: Norway was not born from unity. It was born when Vikings killed Vikings, when free men decided that freedom was too expensive, too unstable, too dangerous. Every crown in history is forged the same way, not from gold, but from the death of the world that came before it, a world where power was fragile, where kings could be challenged, where obedience was optional. That world died at Hafrsfjord, and from its grave, a kingdom rose, stronger, more organized, less free. This is the final scar of Hafrsfjord, not the bodies left in the water, not the ships broken against stone, but the realization that once a people accept a king, they never get their freedom back. Harald won, Norway was born, and the Viking world as it had existed for centuries ended.